Everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. My name is Tyler Brentley, and I serve as the director of the Black Cultural Center. Thank you so much for joining us. We're very excited to have you tonight and look forward to this evening's discussion where we'll talk about anti-Blackness in the APIDA community. Before we begin, I'd like to start by reciting our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the Tutelo and Monacan people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live, and recognize their continuing connection to the land, water, and air that Virginia Tech consumes. We pay respect to the Tutelo and Monacan nations and to their elders past, present, and emerging. We also acknowledge the university's historical ties to the indentured and enslaved laborers built this institution. We pay respect to those people for their contributions to Virginia Tech. Now, I hope everyone is excited for our panel discussion this evening, which would not have been possible without the efforts of the Asian Cultural Engagement Center and our amazing panelists, whom you'll meet just in a minute. Again, thank you all for joining us this evening, and I'll now turn it over to Dr. Nina Ha, who will introduce our panelists for this event.
Thank you, Tyler. You've been a wonderful collaborator. So I really appreciate you too. And thank you to the panelists. I am going to read their names and where they're from and their bio and the title of their talk in order of their talk. So Dr. Jae Kim is a visiting assistant professor from Davidson College. Dr. Kim is in the Department of Sociology. His research and interests center around the singular significance of anti-Blackness and its relation to the construction of modernity and global racial order. He is currently working on his book manuscript, Yellow Over Black, The Pre-Colonial and Colonial History of Race in Korea, 1883 to 1945. And the title of his talk for today is Not to be Slaves of Others, Anti-Blackness in Pre-Colonial Korea. The next presenter is Sharon Chun Wetero, who is an assistant field director and a full-time lecturer at California State University, Dominguez Hills in the Department of Social Work. With over 25 years in social work, Sharon Chun Wetero currently serves as the assistant, oh, sorry, I've already read that, sorry. She has expertise in teaching and training in diagnostic assessment, community mental health, and critical race theory. Clinically, Sharon has worked extensively with families in child welfare system, in the community mental health system, and the system serving children and adults with developmental disabilities in California and Ohio. Sharon is actively integrates critical race studies and mindfulness into her teaching, practice, and community service. And the title of her talk is Using Critical Race Theory to Fight Anti-Blackness. And just on a personal note, I've known Sharon, we were just talking about this for almost 20 years now. So that's a really long time. So thank you, Sharon, so much for being here. And then finally, the last presenter is Dr. Tessan Kim, who is the Strategic Diversity Initiatives Manager at the University of California Office of the President. Dr. Kim has over 15 years of experience in the areas of diversity, recruitment, retention, and achievement in higher education. In her current role as a Strategic Diversity Initiatives Manager, in her role, she's the advisor and content expert to the university leaders and DEI practitioners, as well as develops, coordinates, and implements the UC's diversity initiatives for faculty, staff, and students. She comes to UC from Charlotte, North Carolina, where she was the inaugural director of multicultural affairs and professor of educational studies at Davidson College. There, she led efforts to diversify the core curriculum, reduce bias in the faculty and senior staff hiring process, eliminate the achievement gap for first-year students of color, expand cultural resource centers, and taught courses in Asian American community formations and intergroup dialogue on racism. Dr. Kim has also directed retention and academic achievement programs for Native Americans, first-generation college students, and low-income students at Syracuse University and Michigan State University, sorry. Dr. Kim received her BA in anthropology from Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, and her MA and PhD in anthropology from Michigan State University. And the title of her talk is Wedges, Warriors and Weapons, Asian Americans and Racial Justice Movements in Higher Education. So thank you so much for all of you. And oh, by the way, also, I've known Dr. Kim for quite a while as well. So I really appreciate them all being here. So we're going to start with Dr. J. Kim first.
Okay, Tyler and Dr. Ha and everyone at Virginia Tech, thank you very much for inviting me to this wonderful panel with fantastic audience. I also like to pay respect to the Tirolo, Monacan nations, as well as the Catawba Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work and live here at Davidson, North Carolina. And I would also like to pay my respect to the enslaved people whose abject condition was ontologically essential to the survival of my people. Well, I do acknowledge that my second respect was not quite typical. However, I hope the oddity becomes clear after my talk. So let me share my PPT. Okay. There you go. Okay, today I'd like to talk about why revealing racism and anti-Blackness in historical Korea is not a trivial and local matter, but answers significant questions of modernity. I'm sure many are wondering about the title. What does not to be slaves of others mean? And how is it related to colonial modernity and anti-Blackness? Oh, by the way, I changed the title slightly. Hope you don't mind. Okay, so let me summarize what I'm trying to argue throughout this talk. One, race is a pivotal component of modernity. Two, an ontological condition, a possibility of becoming or remaining modern is anti-Blackness. Okay, let's talk about the first one. If you are familiar with studies of race, you may agree. And thank you very much. What's new? I'll tell you about the new context soon. Well, meanwhile, I know the second is something many of you haven't thought about and make many of you baffled. What's anti-Blackness to do with the history of Korea? Well, not just you. I mean, obviously, Korea was colonized by the same race. Well, with its dramatic economic development, not many even count Korea as one of the powerful countries around the world. Well, that's new to me. But anyway, accordingly, along with globalization, or should I say global migration, many Black people and many others are living in Korea and interacting with Koreans now. If you don't know, they are going through different levels of racism. Okay, that's that. But it has nothing to do with the history of race in Korea, as Korea has been a uni-ethnic nation, for sure. So, what would you say if I tell you I'll demonstrate why my arguments are right by showing the history of racism and anti-Blackness in Korea? So to make my argument more significant and also interesting, I have to revisit the convoluted entity, so-called modernity, or should I say modernities, just in case. Now we know that modernity isn't really about one-directional modernization. It is not teleological with multiple contingencies and paths. And our understanding of the future of modernity and those possibilities are only partial. Regardless, if you examine the scholarship, the big processes still matter, such as class formation, industrialization, revolution, nation, and so on. And lately, we talk about gender, sexuality, and colonialism. Without involving with those big processes, it is no longer modernity. When you think about multiple possibilities of modernity, in other words, what guides us are possible junctures of those big processes. Then, what about race and modernity? According to Charles Mills, race and racism are central to modernity, and the politics of race shapes the politics of the social contract, which is a foundation of modern life. If you think about the United States of America and its history, I'm for sure most of you, hopefully all of you agree. So if I put it in another way, race and racism are the big processes of modernity, as significant as capitalism, if not more. And the making of modernity for sure required coloniality. And what Walter Minolo, one of the prominent scholars of colonialism in Latin America, what he acknowledges is colonialism is almost another name of racial domination. What is even more important is this racial domination continues as post-colonial nations are still involved with racial domination, such as domination of Creole elites. Okay, beyond racial domination and oppression, which is the very focal point of sociological studies of race, Moon Ki-jung and Joel Vargas claim it is necessary to distinguish anti-Blackness from racism. The edited volume to the right will be available in April, and my chapter is also there. Okay, anyway, what they argue is beyond domination, what separates anti-Blackness from racism is its ontological dimension. While domination assumes the commonality of the human and the social, in other words, what it means to be human and what it means to be society, anti-Blackness is an ontological condition of possibility of modern world sociality. According to them, a world without racism requires deep transformations in social practices and structures. A world without anti-Blackness necessitates an entirely new conception of the social, which is to say, a radically different world altogether. So, who gets to be the human? What it means to be the social? To make sense of these, what is required is the concept of non-being. And the non-being cannot be imagined without anti-Blackness, part and parcel of racial slavery, social death, and its afterlife. Okay, what about East Asia then? What about Korea? So now migration studies and multiculturalism almost dominating the scholarship on East Asia, at least the fields related to my academic interest. However, colonial modernity still draw many scholarly attention, and it also assumed multiple ways of appropriating modernity. However, what is at odds is, according to Lee and Cho, when the journal Culture Studies, the journal, came up with a special issue on colonial modernity in East Asia, they argue coloniality, modernity in East Asia has become more of a national matter than a racial one, because both the colonizer, Japan, and the colonized belong to the same yellow race. Their symbiotic experiences of imperialism and colonization eventually formed the core of nationalism in various East Asian societies. Okay, well, Japanese colonialism was not possible without the notion of race, that's for sure. I mean, I think they kind of overlook, but that's not the issue here. However, many still argue it is qualitatively different from the Western ones. Certainly, it was quite different. So, while racial domination was involved, its colonial subjects were considered as the same race overall. I have a lot to talk about this, but anyway, let's assume we agree with it. So should I call it poverty racial domination and therefore wasn't durable? What is more important is, unlike post-colonial nation state in Latin America, what they assume is the absence of racial domination in post-colonial nation states. Well, I do acknowledge that history and a historical presence of Ainu people in Japan and China is much more than the Han ethnicity. Those are certainly important, but let's set them aside for now. If you look at Korea, we really don't see historical racial domination. other than rampant racism in contemporary Korea. Then, many quickly assume the contemporary phenomena is something new, and that is why they can still argue race was superseded by a nation in the discussion of colonial modernity in East Asia. Well, you may think what happens in East Asia remains in East Asia. No theoretical relevance anyway. However, the absence of race in colonial modernity is not as simple as it implies. Race, the supposedly critical component of modernity, can be simply superseded by nation or just elided. If that is the case, race and racism become no longer pivotal, as you can simply overcome by selective appropriation. And this was just easier without different racial bodies. And what about anti-Blackness then? I mean, this part then becomes almost nonsensical. Based on conventional wisdom, anti-Blackness in historical Korea simply has no place. It is just unthinkable. Then we assume anti-Blackness is a bounded ontological foundation. I know, what an oxymoron it is. So today, not just about my talk, what this panel will talk about is also our effort to answer these very significant questions. What happened and what is happening and what will happen in Korea, as well as Korean American society and community, aren't just about isolated locality. So to answer these questions, let me propose a concept of the colonially vulnerable, and it questions the ways in which the peoples who were susceptible to foreign rule in the age of empire, the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So those people make sense of the world. In other words, by focusing on their making sense of the world, I talk about their agency beyond resistance and their agency prior to being colonized. So more specifically, how did Koreans before Japanese colonialism racially make sense of the world without observable racial domination and corporeal presence of Black people? Okay, hopefully you guys found these questions are quite interesting. So here goes the brief history of Korea. In 1905, through the Ulsa Treaty, Korea became a protectorate of Japan. Well, some scholars assume this is the official starting point of colonization, but the official colonization followed 5 years later. Anyway, what is important here is Koreans were on the verge of being colonized. Okay, after the treaty, Jang Ja-yeon, the chief writer of Hwangseong-sinmun, one of the most influential newspapers during the time, wrote one of the most well-known pieces in pre-colonial Korean history. I'm not really sure how many of you have gone through Korean education, but I am pretty sure if you have gone through, then you have heard about his name and the title, 시랴 방송되고, which is translated as I wail bitterly today. Alas, 4,000-year-old territory and 500 years of sovereignty were given over to the other, forcing 20 million souls to become slaves of others. Alas, bitter, alas, resentful, our 20 million brethren, enslaved brethren. What was quite outstanding here is around the treaty, there was soaring usage of the word slave and its cognates throughout newspapers, not just about this, but all around Korea. And this is much more than a simple reflection of Korea's thinking outlook. So around the late Joseon dynasty, most Koreans were nobi. Nobi means the Korean form of the enslaved. If this is the case, if most Koreans were nobi, what is the reason for wailing bitterly? You are nobi, you are nobi, you will be nobi. What's the context? Why are you so sad, right? And the word, no. However, not to be slave of others quickly became one of the national slogans. And the word slave, it really didn't mean nabi. Rather, it was Black slaves who are predestined to be extinct. Since my time is short, I can put all the context here. However, it never meant there will be the same context of those black slaves. Rather, they argue, in America, blacks and reds have become slaves to whites and were violated by them. The reason they have reached the verge of extinction is natural selection, because the brain power of the races is indeed inferior to whites. However, this is a direct quote from the newspaper. However, Koreans will never face the same fate. Blacks, as well as reds, were predestined to enslavement because their innately inferior nature, while Koreans' inherent and cultural superiority would lead them in the opposite direction. This is the ontological condition of their possibility of sociality, or the modernity. Well, this happened after colonization. But since the hold on a second. So what they meant was whiteness as civilization. So this goes beyond one-dimensional racial hierarchy. Why? Because they assume whiteness as civilization, and they assume this is something achievable. So the hierarchy is quite temporal. And this is the temporal hierarchy of the social and of the human. But at the same time, blackness was something morbid, extinction and annihilation. And this isn't really about the level of differences, but it's qualitatively different context. So it's really not about beyond the bound. It's not really about the bottom group, but it's much beyond. An ontological condition of possibility of becoming or remaining modern was their non-blackness. Ontological abjection of blackness was their destiny. So if you go through all those things, then their fear of enslavement and extinction gets higher, along with heightened notion of anti-blackness. Okay, then let me talk a little bit more about what happened after colonization. But since the Declaration of Independence, which happened in 1919, is considered one of the defining moments of Korean history, I'll talk about its racial subtext and the continuing significance of racism and anti-blackness in historical Korea. So first, please note the word enslavement and its relation to colonization, the enslavement of 20 million resent people by force. And then the declaration goes, Japan's scholars and officials indulging in a conqueror's exuberance have denigrated the accomplishments of our ancestors and treated our civilized people like barbarians. In other words, it urges the world that Koreans are civilized and not barbarians. Then I am sure many would wonder, by the way, who are those barbarians? And the original word in the declaration is tomein, which literally means ignorant natives. And who are ignorant natives? In most cases, they were enslaved people. No, they were enslaved blacks, or often indigenous people who are predestined to be extinct. So no racial policies, no directly observable racial domination. Therefore, while these, should I say anecdote or these stories? No, not like that, but anyway, let's assume that. While these may be outrageous, the existing sociological theory is limited to understand how Koreans made sense of the world in the age of empire without structural significance. This may be theoretically interpreted as anecdotal. However, is it? So I want you to think about how the antisocial condition of enslaved or soon to be eliminated race was the very possibility of the very condition of modernity, and the very condition of the human, and the very condition of the social. And also, let's think about my first argument. So I'm revisiting the first two arguments that I was going to make, right? Race as the pivotal components of modernity, which cannot be just simply negated, just like industrialization. So through those quick, very short examples, hopefully I showed you enough. And by examining the history of race in Korea, I have shown it's not just about accidental locality that has nothing to do with theoretical significance. Rather, what I've shown is the epitome of what Chung and Vargas claim, that the ontological condition of possibility of becoming or remaining modern is anti-Blackness. And this is the reason we have to distinguish anti-Blackness from racism, as the latter is based on the sociological theory of domination. So thank you very much. And I hope my talk gives you one more reason to remain in this Zoom room for upcoming panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Sharon, do you want to go next?
Sure. So let's see. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm Sharon Chunwetaro, and I am part of the social work program at Cal State University Dominguez Hills. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to try to explain how we use critical race theory to fight anti-Blackness. But first, I want to just acknowledge the land on which I'm sitting on, and also where our university sits on. And that is, it's the home and traditional land of the Tongva Nation. And today I come with respect and gratitude for the Tongva people who still consider themselves as caretakers of this land. In addition, I want to pay tribute to those who, laborers who were enslaved, undocumented, or otherwise, who built the university and built all the things that I get to enjoy every day. CRT, I'm sure you've heard of CRT. I think the last president that we had gave it a little extra marketing unintendedly, because it was banned from any agency in the federal government that was utilizing it. It was started in the 1970s, really in legal scholarship, and some of the scholars below are really the founders of critical race theory. They critiqued the law, and they saw, even though the law claimed to be colorblind, it was not. And so CRT is a lens through which we can understand and analyze oppression, and particularly the role of systemic oppression in our lives and how we see ourselves. And just so you know, I'm coming from the lens of a Chinese American cisgender woman, third and sixth generation, born here, born in California, came from a middle class family, and have a lens of faith in Christianity. So I just wanted to share that a little bit about myself, because we'll talk about intersectionality. But critical race theory was adopted through education and through also social work. And so we're having a lot more scholarship in social work in terms of how we apply critical race theory to social work practice. There's a series of tenets that I'm going to walk you through, and it's not all of them. It's just a few of them, just to kind of get your brains thinking about why CRT is important. As we talk about CRT, and I'm sure many of you have participated in racism dialogues or dialogues in diversity and oppression. And I want to just share with you that to challenge us to move from what we call a safe space to a brave space. So we know in these dialogues, you often start off with, guidelines, group rules, group norms, shared understandings. And some of the ones that often come up are, well, it's okay to agree to disagree, or we're going to respect everyone's viewpoint, regardless of where they're coming from. And not that I have a problem with respect, but we have seen that sometimes dialogue really gets stuck in terms of when, say, people of color start to talk about, or they hear something that was offensive that was made to them, and they start to wonder, should I say something or not? Is it going to be well received or not received at all? And so two guidelines that we utilize, I know when we talk with in our program with students, is about controversy with civility as one, And that in order for us to have authentic dialogue about things that are tough to talk about, we need to be okay with having controversy. And we can do that in a civil way, in a way that is respectful. And also, it's so important to acknowledge that, we may say something, may make a microaggression, and we didn't intend to be offensive to another person, but we have to take ownership of not only the intention behind it, but also the impact that we're making on that other person. All right, let's start with one of the really I think one of the pivotal tenets within CRT, and our colleague just illustrated that about race, that race is socially constructed. And so, we look back in time. I mean, we all know that there really is no biological basis for race. And so, we will have people that are more biologically similar by DNA across different racial groups, as opposed to, say, two groups that, two African groups, for instance, they have much more biological, DNA diversity than groups apart from each other. If we look at the 1450s, when the construction of race, one of the ways that it came about within the world in terms of how people were enslaved, if they were constructed as Black, was Prince Henry the Navigator. My source is Dr. Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And he talks about how he created, he basically enslaved people from African countries exclusively, and that he was a creator of race. In the 1700s with Linnaeus, with the racial taxonomy, Linnaeus basically constructed a hierarchy, and he put the Black race that was constructed at the very bottom and called them Homo sapiens afer, and constructed them as sluggish, lazy, kinky hair, flat nose, thick lips, covered by grease, ruled by caprice. And that then influenced the Age of Enlightenment. That then influenced the rise of social Darwinism and eugenics, which then further created a narrative around enslaving Black people or Black bodies. We moved then to Jim Crow, that even though we gave, slavery was not the law of the land, people were still enslaved. People were still subject to segregation, mass incarceration, lynching. And then fast forward to the 1990s, where we have pseudo-social scientists like Herrnstein and Murray, who are very influential in creating policies or making policies that impacted resources given to Black and Brown individuals and Indigenous people. So they wrote this book in the 90s called The Bell Curve. And basically, they said that IQ scores, and that's what this demographic here, this picture here, they showed consistently that IQ scores were always different between whites and African Americans and Latinx folks. And that because of that, they said that IQs were a greater predictor of how of social outcomes later. And therefore, why should we bother putting resources in higher education or just in general to people? Because it's biologically determined that they're not going to be do as well, in society or in life. And then, of course, these social constructions have continued to justify, ongoing systemic oppression, such as police brutality, de facto segregation, school-to-prison pipeline, voter suppression, and mass incarceration. And of course, we still use standardized tests, although with the pandemic, it's a little bit different on how that will be utilized in some colleges and universities. The next tenet, differential racialization. So this applies to, this tenet means basically that people in power have, namely whites, have the power to define these socially constructed races differently over time. And we can see that with Asians and Asian Americans. So they were, if we look at Linnaeus and the taxonomy, he constructed Asians, Homo sapiens, let me find my notes here. He constructed Asians as melancholy, stern, black hair, dark eyes, strict, haughty, greedy, and ruled by opinion. And so as a result of social construction, it became justifiable then for Chinese coolie laborers to be excluded in 1882 by the Chinese Exclusion Act, or Japanese and Japanese Americans to be seen as enemies, to be incarcerated in the camps by Executive Order 9066. And then later, Asian Americans, as we know, were constructed differently in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. And they were constructed as model minorities as a way to discredit African Americans who were fighting for everyone, and also other groups of color. And so this model minority obviously continues to exist. I'll talk about that in the next slide. And then, fast forward to now, last year with COVID, the Asian Americans and particularly Chinese were, seen as virus bringers to the United States, responsible for bringing on this pandemic. And of course, that was the rhetoric that we heard from our former president as well. I want to take a moment to just talk a little bit about model minority and how model minority, contributes to anti-Blackness in the Asian American community. How have we internalized this model? So if there's a model minority, then that implies that there is a deficit minority, that if people aren't living up or can't achieve that American dream, then it must be on them. It must be whether it's IQ or biologically determined or whatever it is, lifestyle, whatever it is, that gets attributed to other groups. And so, there's a belief in the Asian American community about, meritocracy. I think model minority and meritocracy, go hand in hand. Well, if I could do it, then why can't, someone else of a different group do it? I've experienced oppression. Why can't people pick themselves up from their bootstraps? And I think people believe that, standardized tests are an accurate measure of intelligence. And so what you see here in this picture is a picture of several APIDAs and also non-APIDAs in California. And they were fighting for, we were trying to pass affirmative action in Prop 16 last November, and it failed 57%, I think, to 43%. And I saw these signs, No on 16, all over my community in Los Angeles, in the suburb that I live, which happens to have a lot of Asians and Asian Americans living in it. And it got me to thinking about, that I very rarely see signs in my community when an election happens. But for once, I saw all these signs, and I felt that, saddened that people really bought into the model minority myth, belief in meritocracy. We know that there's consequences to internalized racism, and everything from mental health issues of people, internalizing this model minority myth, and all the way to, the complicity that we engage in with white supremacy and capitalism as a result of believing and internalizing, becoming assimilated in this country. So connected to the meritocracy myth is a tenet known as the critique of liberalism. And so liberalism goes back to that age of enlightenment, John Locke, the social contract, individualism, freedom, democracy, equal rights. And but unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, the meritocracy myth, that everyone can pick themselves up by their bootstraps, is what continues to be the dominant narrative in this country. And so I think we as Asian Americans and otherwise need to really question that. How much have I really bought into that? All right. Another tenet is racism is ordinary. And this belief, or this tenet, illustrated by my first example actually has to do with obviously the insurrection, where I was thinking, if people couldn't see that that was a racist act, that people gathered and stormed the Capitol and broke into offices and tried to overturn the electoral voting process as racist, how could people not see that? And yet we have a significant amount of GOP lawmakers that don't see it that way. So, that's a clear illustration of racism as ordinary in this country. And then also, on a more micro level, microaggressions. So these are slights and insults and behaviors that sometimes are not intended to hurt another person, but they take away someone's humanity. They take away someone's racial, the reality of racism in their life and other isms. And so, here are just some examples. Dr. Gloria Ladding-Billings, who is a CRT scholar in education, writes and talks about microaggressions being 10,000 paper cuts. And actually, Dr. Kendi hates this term microaggressions because he says it's microabuse, what people have to endure every day. Intersectionality. So many of you are familiar about intersectionality. And intersectionality is connected to not only our own social identities, but also our positionality within society and within different contexts based on not only these social identities based on race, gender identity, sexual orientation, religious background, being indigenous or not indigenous. These are connected to all the isms that are attached to it, the systems of oppression that are attached to it. So when we think about intersectionality and in working with other people, we always have to be questioning, how have I benefited from my intersecting identities? How have I benefited from laws and policies based on that? And then how have I not benefited? And keeping that in mind when we're working with other people. Particularly as we're working towards fighting racism and anti-Blackness. Self-reflexivity is a concept related to critical self-reflection. And so the definition means stepping outside yourself to examine yourself from an alternate perspective, your unquestioned or unconscious beliefs about yourself and reality. It encourages different stances towards those whose communication processes we wish to understand. So as a social worker, and most of you probably don't know this, but 65% of all psychotherapy services in this country are actually done by social workers. And so the example I want to just kind of pull out is, if I'm a clinical social worker, a psychiatric social worker, and I'm working with an African-American man, and he's coming into my mental health clinic to seek services. And if he starts to get, upset or angry or agitated, what's the attribution I'm going to make as an Asian American female? So I need to be always aware of maybe how I'm feeling at the time, and we call that self-awareness. If I'm starting to feel uncomfortable or worried or threatened. But self-reflexivity takes this to another level. I have to be thinking about, why am I feeling this way? How is it that I'm feeling this way? What are the constructs and what are the lessons and socialization that I've encountered in my life and within all my intersectional identities that, lead me to construct African-American men as a threat or as someone that I should be, worried about, or the criminality or, being a gang member, for instance. So I need to really check that and think of, is what I'm seeing really reflection of, frustration against a really racist mental health system, or is it something else? So that's just an example of self-reflexivity, just checking my biases and really thinking and deconstructing where they're coming from. And then the other piece that I want to make you think about is, how do I respond if I'm corrected or given feedback? If I make a microaggression, I need to sit with those feelings and then also begin to take ownership again for the impact of what I said or what I did. Counter narratives, that's another tenet within CRT. And so there's a lot of power in counter narratives. We learn to center the voices of people whose voices we don't normally hear. They are people of color, they are students, they are people that have very marginalized lives due to systemic oppression. In that process, CRT promotes a bidirectional approach to learning. So, if you're a teacher, you give up power so that you can really hear and center the voices of your students. It involves cultural humility. We also know that narratives can change systems, it can change laws, it can change policies. And so I was just wanting to share with you a little bit about Latasha Harland, who some of you are familiar with. Latasha was murdered in the early 90s, and she was buying some orange juice in a store in Koreatown in Los Angeles. And Soon Ja-doo, who's one of the owners of the store, shot her. She assumed that Latasha had taken the orange juice when she, without paying for it. And so the video that I watched, and actually was a grad student at the time, all I saw of Latasha was her struggling with Sunjadu and then Sunjadu shooting her. I had no other sense of her at all. In fact, after a while, after it kept playing over and over, I started to feel like she wasn't even a young girl anymore, And so her humanity, I think, was taken away, not only in terms of the portrayal of what we saw in the media, but also by the sentence that was given to Sunjadu, which was probation. And so I want to take a moment just to share with you some observations from Dr. Marcus Hunter, who is the UCLA African American Studies professor. If you have a chance to watch A Love Story for Latasha, it was produced by her family through the lens of her childhood best friend, and it's on Netflix. The family chose not to show that video in the footage, and so this is what Dr. Hunter writes. He says, "This is why movements like Say Her Name are so critical, because it reinforces the notion that regardless of it being 2 hours or 20 years later, Black girls deserve compassion when telling their stories. It's imperative to validate the existence of Black girls, Black boys, and Black people outside of violent crimes committed against their humanity. The world should be overwhelmed with narratives about Black people, with full lives and with plans to love, succeed, and be loved." Lastly, CRT is about a commitment to social justice. And so, CRT is not meant to be hiding out in a library, on a bookshelf, in a database, or sitting in your computer. It's meant to be utilized and as really a call to action. So I really like this Cycle of Liberation by Bobby Harrow. And, there are different ways, if you look at it, there's lots of different ideas of how you can take social justice or social action to really, disrupt anti-Blackness. So you can call in people when they make microaggressions. You can listen to podcasts centering Black voices and Black experiences around oppression and also ways of resistance. You can make calls to support anti-racist legislation or, not supporting supporting racist legislation like, Prop 16, which was an anti-racist legislation that didn't pass. You can work with other APIDA groups engaged in partnerships with other organizations, Black organizations. These are just some of the ways that you can engage in social action. I want to end on this slide. Real knowledge is to know the extent of one's ignorance. And so I want to challenge you and challenge us to look more deeply at the dominant narratives that we've been socialized into in our lives, to deconstruct them and to do the work around learning and centering others' narratives, while also taking ownership of our impact on our actions. Thank you very much.
Hi, Dr. Tessan Kim. It's your turn.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, if you could please give me a time check, that would be great.
I will. Right now it's 5:52. So is it 2:52 your time then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
Let me see here. Let me make sure that you can you just see my presentation?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I can't see my notes. Here we go. All right, so let's begin. I'm going to try to advance it. I do ask that you all help me out here if I start going, if my Wi-Fi starts going off. But yes, I just wanted to start off by saying, throughout my professional career, I've been a TA, an academic advisor, a cultural center director, policy advisor, you name it. And in that time, I have witnessed anti-Blackness expressed from Asian American students, alumni, faculty, staff, administrators, usually in the privacy of one-on-one conversations or in-group gatherings, and sometimes in public domains. Now, obviously, there are many Asian Americans, like all of you, that are committed to being allies and accomplices in the struggle for Black liberation and justice and education, but that's not the topic we've been asked to present on today, so I'm not going to go there today. But instead, what I did want to do was name some of the obvious and not so obvious expressions of anti-Blackness within Asian American communities in the higher education context, and introduce theoretical perspectives that, by the way, the previous speakers have also kind of touched on as well, that have helped me to understand how is it possible that Asian Americans, that are people of color, many of whom have been colonized, have been racially socialized to be anti-Black in America, whether we are recent immigrants, whether we're 1.5, multiracial, interracially adopted, US born, liberal, conservative, or apolitical, or so on. And so these are the two frameworks that have helped me to kind of understand how it happened, right? Because we're not just born anti-Black, we're socialized into that. So let's begin with the obvious one. And thank you, Sharon, for kind of kicking us off with this. Let's talk about the one higher ed example that really comes to mind. And that's race-conscious admissions and affirmative action. And what is the anti-Black argument, right? Or the rhetoric about this policy as it pertains to Asian Americans. Asian Americans have historically been used as wedges to create kind of infighting and tension amongst communities of color who are all disadvantaged in white dominant institutions. But the most recent and now quite common framing of Asian Americans as it relates to race-conscious admissions or hiring in affirmative action is what I will just shorthand call zero-sum game argument, which goes something like this, right? There's a finite number of students that can be admitted every year. And so if a college has a race-conscious admissions policy, African-American students with lower standardized test scores and GPAs will be admitted at the expense of Asian American students with equal or higher test scores and GPAs. Now, obviously, admissions decisions are more complicated than that, right? Especially if there's any admissions officers in the room. Those decisions are made based on a variety of factors, such as gender balance, ability to pay full tuition, legacy or relationship to an influential donor, being an athlete, quality of high school, etc. But that's essentially the argument in the zero-sum game perspective, that intelligent, deserving, innocent Asian Americans are positioned as the victims, and intellectually inferior, less deserving African Americans exploiting their racial background are the sources of their victimization. Oh, sorry about that. Previously. Now, this victimhood narrative was the position that was taken by the Asian American Coalition for Education last year, when my office, the UC Office of the President, submitted a proposal to eliminate standardized testing in undergraduate admission to the UC Board of Regents, which, by the way, passed unanimously, and many other universities have since followed suit. But the AACS sent a letter to the board strongly objecting to this move and demanded that the Board of Regents engage the Asian American community and not punish them for falling, quote, falling quality of education in underrepresented communities. In this letter, they argued that the SAT and ACTs were, quote, empirically designed tests, end of quote. I see you smiling, Sharon, and that they are objective and fair, and that by eliminating them or going test optional threatens to, and this is a quote, a direct quote, undermine American meritocracy, hinder our nation's technological progress, and jeopardize our national security, end of quote. This letter and other similar open letters by Asian American politicized organizations that oppose race conscious missions illustrates the first perspective I want to, that has kind of helped me with this, and that's racial triangulation. So some scholars like James Lowen and Gary Okihiro have speculated about which side of the color line Asian Americans are on. Are we closer to white people or are we closer to Black people? Others like Michael Omi and Winot emphasize the distinct racialized experiences and trajectories of minoritized groups in America and suggest that their racialized or racialization is shaped by experiences of genocide, slavery, colonization, and immigration exclusion in the case of Asian Americans. But Claire Jean Kim, no relation, I don't think, argues that neither perspective is adequate. Give you a moment to read that quote there, but so though historical context matters, I mean, definitely matters, Kim argues that racialized groups, in this case, Asian Americans, are not racialized in a vacuum. Instead, she argues that Asian Americans are racially triangulated within a field of race relations based on their position relative to Black people and white people in an inferior superior access and an insider foreigner access. I know this is a little dated, 1999. I probably would have said citizen foreigner access, but anyways. She argues that Asian Americans are, on one hand, racially valorized as being superior to Black people, but they are civically ostracized as foreigners and therefore inferior to white people, right? Not fully ever assimilatable. Wow, that's a powerful statement, isn't it? So if you want to look at this diagram, and see where Asian Americans fall on the X and Y axis, what Kim is saying is Asian Americanness is to be situated in America as superior to Blackness, not equal to, not similar to, not akin to, but superior to. Now, that was certainly the case when migrant laborers from China were hired to replace and punish recently emancipated African Americans seeking wage labor after the Civil War, right? The Chinese laborers were said to be harder working, right? More agreeable, more obedient, and easier to control. And this should not surprise any of you because many of us have internalized that messaging that we are smarter, right? Don't brag, but we are smarter, right? We do math better. Our math is better. We work harder, right? They're lazy. The Americans are lazy. We work harder, right? We're easier to work with. We're more tolerant. Even if we're abused and exploited, we're not going to complain or unionize or picket, right? The infographics are very friendly to Asian Americans if we are included in them at all. Our net income, low divorce rates, low crime rates, college enrollment and graduation rates, our overrepresentation in STEM fields, which are the hardest sciences, right? Those are hard sciences, right? How quickly Asian Americans diversify academic department vis-a-vis Blacks, Latinos, Native Americans, and even sometimes whites. It is this simultaneous process of racial valorization and ostracism, right, along with the racial subordination and stigmatization of African Americans that Kim argues maintains systems of white supremacy and white privilege. So the implicit and explicit stereotyping of African Americans as intellectually inferior, lazy, undeserving, and the menacing minority, and the stereotyping of Asian Americans as the intellectually superior, innocent people that are hardworking, that get where they are in life purely through merit and making us the model minority, right? Unfortunately, the reinforcement of that kind of thinking not only, I would say, falsely makes us feel that we are honorary whites, but it also falsely gives us the impression that we are socially distanced from African Americans, which leads me to the second perspective, and that's Afro-Pessimism. Okay, so one of the more controversial, so what is Afro-Pessimism? And I think Dr. Kim actually referenced a lot of very similar principles. Let's see here. So Afro-Pessimism is, I would say, a critical subset of critical Black studies that really argues that the African-American experience in the United States is just qualitative. I think this is the word that you use, Jay, right? That it is just qualitatively different from other experiences of colonized and oppressed, racialized peoples. That there is a distinct experience of slaveness that is associated with the Black experience. And it comes across in a variety of ways. Now, one of the more controversial tenets of Afro-Pessimism is that when non-Black people of color, whether they are immigrants from Asia, immigrants from the Caribbean, Latinx, multiracials, Middle East, North Africans, that when they come to the United States or when they're born in the United States, they benefit from institutions' diversity commitments while distancing themselves whenever they can from the Black people who struggled, sacrificed, and fought for these gains and positions. So while an organization may erect cultural centers, academic programs, special events, and they may open the door for a diverse student body, staff, and faculty, the representation of African Americans at that same institution may remain stagnant or diminish, and experiences of anti-Black violence from law enforcement officers, as well as the policing of Black bodies on that campus by peers, or the Karen effect, may still persist, even while the institution is claiming that they're committed to diversity and equity. And there are ample examples of academic departments that manage to hire an abundance of international faculty and students and graduate students, and Asian Americans, but they cannot seem to find or close the deal on hiring African American candidates. The UC is not the only example, but even at medical programs, you will find that optometry programs or pharmacy programs or engineering programs, where the majority of the faculty and students of color that have benefited from these diversity initiatives, right, once they represent the majority, they kind of hire their own, right, people from their own ethnic background. And African American diversity numbers either flatline, they remain at 0, or they go down. So there are, and so that's kind of like what this little graphic here is trying to show. Yeah, here it's just, it's a very blurry clipping, but what you'll notice is that a lot of schools and a lot of universities have spent millions and millions of dollars, right, on diversity programs. And yet when you really kind of get down to the weeds, what have they actually achieved and done for African Americans? And oftentimes what you'll notice is that a lot of these universities, even in their building of these massive, inclusive, ADA compliant buildings, they've actually displaced African American communities that neighbor those universities, that the poverty and the inequality that's literally down the street or the track from them persistently become, I mean, they just remain, the same, if not worse, right? And yet the institution loves multiculturalism, and they're so committed to diversity. Yeah. I'm going to say it. Oh, I'm going to get in trouble for this, but this was an incident from UC Irvine not too long ago. There's also student affairs, right? Student cultural center examples. So there are cases of Asian American fraternities and sororities that presumably modeled their their groups after African-American Greek systems. And they've been caught throwing blackface parties, or Asian American celebrities appropriating Black culture and profiteering off of that. And when they're called out, they're quick to say that they were ignorant of their actions being racist and anti-Black, that they were ignorant that what they were doing were appropriating. Ignorant, not a word that is commonly associated with Asian American college students. But you know, if you were to ask me, I would say that feigning ignorance about anti-Black racism to avoid being sanctioned or boycotted would be considered, at least in my book, another layer of violence against African-American people. So I'm gonna move on to my final slide here. So in December of 2019, so I want to go back to affirmative action and college admissions and test scores. So in December of 2019, just before the pandemic hit, civil rights organizations and the Compton School District in California filed a lawsuit against the University of California, demanding that we stop requiring that applicants have to take and submit the SATs and ACTs for freshman admission. The lawsuit declares, and I will say that had a lot to do with us finally, although our president was all about dropping the SATs and ACTs or going test optional, but it definitely expedited the decision. And the lawsuit declares that, quote, the requirement that all applicants submit SAT or ACT scores systematically and unlawfully denies talented and qualified students with less accumulated advantage a fair opportunity to pursue higher education at UC, and that it was causing unjustifiable squandering of time and resources and intense stress for them, their families, and their schools. Now, the lawsuit, Kawika Smith versus the Regents, was filed on behalf of 4 California students, including Smith, a low-income African-American high school student in the South Los Angeles area. Also joining the legal action for Compton School District were 6 community organizations: Little Manila Rising, Dolores Huerta Foundation, College Seekers, College Access Plan, the Chinese for Affirmative Action, and Community Coalition. Asian American students and community activists are featured prominently in this lawsuit, in a coalition with Black and Latinx students and community organizers. And to me, this is what I want to wrap up with. This is an example of being warriors, right? Being warriors in the struggle for Black liberation and for racial justice. Being able to work in partnership, in coalition, to bring about material change. Now, what I will say is the jury is out, but just 2 weeks ago, we just found out that UCLA and UC Berkeley's fall 2021 application process, we had an increase of 48% applicants from African Americans. And I believe it's because of the decisions that we made to drop the SATs and the ACTs. But I'm keeping my fingers crossed because we still have to read the applications, offer letters of admission, and they have to want to come. So I will say that that's the end of my talk, and I think we're ready now for questions and comments.
Wow, thank you so much, everybody. That was incredible. Like, I really, really learned a lot from all of you. I wanted to take this time to thank you, and then to also ask if any of the attendees had questions for the panelists. And I think there actually is a question for the panelists. Let's see, Tyler, do you mind reading it?
Perfect. So the question is, what is to be done at the institutional level to implement practices that define diversity beyond just differences, but centered on the racial ontology predicated upon anti-Blackness, normalization of whiteness, and the racially triangulated position of Asian Americans?
Well, I'll go first. I think the first step is you have to define the term diversity, multicultural, inclusive. It has, I mean, that's how power works, right? It's a chameleon. It changes and evolves in order to reproduce itself. And the language of diversity, equity, and inclusion has been co-opted in order to expand power to those who already kind of have it, right? So I think what's really important is that an institution that cares about Black people and about racial justice, even land acknowledgements to Indigenous people, you have to put your money where your mouth is, and you have to create very transparent accountability metrics, dashboards, whatever you want to call it. And it has to be very specific. And, I'm saying this tongue in cheek. Those of you who know me know that I'm very, very sarcastic, right? But you know that I'm very sarcastic. And if the tenets of Afro-Pessimism are correct, a lot of people of color, whether they are immigrants, whatever, people of color, they want to distance themselves from being Black. When put at the table, right? People are very quick to distance themselves from being Black Americans. And so, all right, we know what Blackness is. Let's count. Let's show progress. We have shown progress. In Asian Americans, I mean, think about it. We're like 5% of the US population, yet 55% of us have college degrees, right? We are overrepresented in a lot of places, And so, make sure that the definition is clear, that nobody is confused, and that there's transparent metrics.
Can I answer next on this one? I'm really situated in a unique university at Cal State Dominguez Hills. And so it was actually founded where the location is, which is in Carson, California, next to Compton and South LA. It was supposed to be in Palos Verdes, where it's much, much more wealthy. But during the Watts Rebellion, people fought to have that campus located where it is, and rightfully so. And so, amongst Masters of Social Work programs, it's really interesting how people can do admissions and how they construct the way that they're gatekeeping. So, in our program, because we are rooted in critical race theory, we make our application is really unique. We don't ask students to necessarily know what they want to do when they grow up, in social work, because nobody really knows, really. So we are looking for candidates that have a commitment to social justice, which is really what social work is about. And we also make sure that they give enough space, pages, to write a narrative. We want to hear about their narrative. We want to hear about their journey into social work, and so we take space for that. Other universities, they might give them 2 pages to tell their story and answer 5 questions. And how are you going to do that? You can't get to know this person. And then we ask this one question on there, and that is, tell us about, we do full disclosure first that we are, CRT focused. And then we say, tell us about your understanding of systems of oppression, along gender, along sexual orientation, along people who are undocumented or immigration. And, we can tell from that sort of where people are coming from. We don't expect them to know CRT at all, but we want to see a commitment to an understanding that there are systems at play here that lead people into the situations that they're in. And so that's one way, that we try to make it more equitable for people in terms of our program. But I think our university as a whole, when CRT got banned, and, our president, who's African-American, our provost, they knew what we do, that we talk about CRT all the time. They've been in our trainings, right? But we knew they would not say anything to us. So thankfully, we've always felt, I think, pretty well supported, in that area.
I do want to say, for those who are not Californians in the call, racial reporting is especially hard in California because, as Sharon said, of Prop 209, California, it is illegal. You cannot look at a student's race or gender. You can look at their income. Anyways, you saw my look, right? You can look at everything else, right? You can look at what their zip code. But anyways, but you can't look at race. I mean, literally, admissions officers are not allowed to look at that information. And so when you have a commitment to serving a community, not individuals, but communities, you have to get creative. And you have to make sure that you're doing a lot of outreach, that admissions officers are going through rigorous implicit bias training. It's a commitment. You have to put a lot of elbow grease into it, but it's possible.
So thank you very much for those wonderful, fantastic answers. I mean, since those two panelists are more involved with institutional level, how we cope with those things. So I really have nothing to add to that, but I like to say one more thing. So when you think about diversity, I want you to think about what I mean by differences, because the prerequisite of diversity is the notion of differences. And when you think about the notion of differences, and I want you to think about what do you mean by those differences and how that construction of the differences also related to our ontological foundation and how it actually draws a line who belongs and who doesn't belong, not just about institutional level of belonging, but who doesn't belong to be the human and who doesn't belong to be the social. So those are, I am pretty critically related to what I talked about throughout my talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. There were two questions in the question and answer. So the first one is sort of interesting. What are some examples of narratives that might replace the model minority myth for a personal narrative? That's number one. And I just also wanted to add number two because we're running low on time. So I wanted to just and have you answer one or both. It doesn't have to be all, but both of them. The second one is, in what ways do you think anti-Blackness has had an impact on, on the growing consumption and social influence of Black culture, i.e. Black fishing, desire for Black facial features, using AAVE, Korean hip hop, drawing heavy influence on Black rap culture?
Can you repeat the first question?
What are some narratives that might replace the model minority myth for a personal narrative?
That you're not a model minority, that you're different, or that, I was going to say, if you're trying to get into a graduate program, about how you really resent how you have been stereotyped, that you are not those ways. One would argue theoretically, you can't escape it. For example, like I could tell you I'm bad at math, but you might not believe me, right? I might tell you, I have this one running joke is, I think I'm a big Korean, I'm a thick Korean woman, but I can't go around saying that because they're like, no, you're not, you're petite, you're little. So if we really think about the way race works, it really doesn't matter what you think of yourself. It really doesn't matter if you think that the racial stereotype doesn't apply to you, that you're an individual. It's gonna stick, right? It's gonna stick. It's not, violence against Black people is not because it's justified violence, right? All sorts of mental acrobatics take place in a person's mind who is racist against Black people to justify their prejudices against them or their stereotypes against them. So yeah, I mean, whatever narrative it is, we can kind of go offline about it, but it doesn't matter within a racialized context. You are raced.
I definitely agree with that. The model minority is so pervasive and so unseeped and so ingrained that I don't think you can, truly escape it. And for me, I think about how I have to be really conscious about it in my thoughts and my actions, how I communicate that, to like my kids, for instance. I have two kids, one's going to go to college in a couple of years. So we're having these interesting conversations about stuff. And, I have to really think deep on like, what would be another replacement narrative to model minority? And I can't come up with something in, in 30 seconds, but.
Well, and it's hard too, because then it turns into another stereotype. So I might not be a docile, submissive woman, but I could be a dragon lady. I'm like, oh, great. So if I'm an aggressive Asian woman, they're going to find another way to racially stereotype. You can't win. Sorry.
So quick, like 30-second, I know answer. Just what do you think of, I guess, the juxtaposition of anti-Blackness with also the growing consumption of Black culture? Like, how do you understand that dichotomy?
Jay, you take this. You know Korean hip hop better than all of us. I've seen you.
Well, it's a tricky question to answer because, well, first of all, I don't really consume K-pop culture. I kind of think it's obnoxious, but that's my personal preference. But here's the thing: the reason I got into this type of study that I do is curiously. So rather, I'd rather talk about this in terms of my my hobby. Or so back then, I was listening to rock music, and I thought those rock musics are culturally superior because it is white music, music from the metropole. And then later, I was exposed to Black music, and somehow because around the time people became people kind of knew people kind of getting to know those like rock music in America, and I wanted to be different, so I wanted to show my let's say my cultural capital is a little different from you guys. So then somehow around the time around the Gangnam area in Korea, there is a huge craze going. There's a huge following about those Black hip hop culture. And all those people who are now, those earlier generations of those Korean hip hop musicians, some of them are my friends, some of them I personally really won't know. That's how also the creation of hip hop culture in Korea. So it's more like a differentiating myself from other mass. So it also has the class connotation into it, but at the same time, it basically try to show your different way of approaching metropole, approaching to the metropole. So that aspect still basically in close relation to creating hierarchy, but at the same time, the way they do is also, and this is a very typical answer, and this the way they do is more like representing Blackness in a certain and monolithic way, and getting profit out of it without, I usually don't like to use this word, but without proper recognition, without deeper consideration. So that's the part I could also talk about. But at the same time, the reason I got into anti-Blackness and I got into Black history was also because of my obnoxious differentiation. So I got to listen to hip hop music, and somehow I got interested. So those are kind of dualism I have in my life. So this isn't really as easy as it sounds to talk about. So I'll just end here. Yeah.
Thank you so much again. Tyler, I'm sorry, we can't answer the last question, but hopefully we will maybe at the next event that we're having. Tyler, do you want to make closing remarks?
Absolutely. So first, I'd like to start by just saying and sending a huge thank you to our panelists for such a thought-provoking and insightful discussion. Thank you so much. We're really appreciative of that. As Nina mentioned, the Black Cultural Center, we do have a number of programs coming up throughout the rest of Black History Month. You're welcome to visit our website that has an all-encompassing list of our events, but I do want to briefly mention an upcoming event on Tuesday, February 9th at 5 p.m. So the Cultural and Community Centers, in partnership with the Women's Center, Center for Humanities, Department of History, Office of Recruitment, Diversity and Inclusion, the Graduate School, VT Engage, College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences, We'll be live streaming The Mountains That Take Wing film, which features internationally renowned scholar, professor, and writer Angela Davis, and 89-year-old grassroots organizer and Nobel Peace Prize nominee Yuri Kochiyama. The film will be followed by a facilitated discussion. We hope to see you all there. I'm going to drop the link in the chat, and everyone have a great evening.
Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.